Hey guys, it's Alex. I'm here with my review for Alias Grace by Margaret Atwood. I finished this book yesterday and I spent the last about 16 hours trying to decide how I feel about it. And I'm still not quite sure. It was a really good book. I'm just not entirely certain that I liked it, which sounds really weird, but I don't know how else to phrase that. This book is a historical fiction novel set in the mid-19th century. I believe it starts in the early 1830s, and it centers around Grace Marks, who was convicted in the 1840s of helping to murder her master. She was a servant. So her master and his housekeeper, who was also his mistress, with James McDermott, who also was a servant in that household. She and McDermott fled after the murders, and they were captured, convicted, both sentenced to death, but her sentence was turned to life, and James McDermott was hanged. Which none of that is spoilers, by the way. That all happens prior to the start of this book. Most of the story takes place when she is actually in prison and she's talking to her doctor, Dr. Simon Jordan's. He's studying psychology. I believe he's one of the first doctors in this country to really focus on psychology and start learning more about that. A lot of her story, like her childhood and adolescence prior to the murder, is told from Grace to her doctor, like in sort of therapy sessions, kind of. The major question in this is whether Grace Marks actually helped to kill them, or if she was just sort of there and forced to go along with it by James McDermott. It's set in the mid-19th century in Canada, and I know practically nothing about the mid-19th century in Canada. They were talking about historical things that were going on at the time and the rebellion and stuff, and I was like, what rebellion? Like, we never covered 1850 in Canada. Like, this was not in my US history class curriculum. But as far as I could tell, it did a really good job of the historical aspects and capturing, like, the way society was structured and the way different classes dealt with each other and the social customs, and just culturally, it felt really accurate and just really well done in that regard. You know, from my perspective of I know nothing, but this seemed like a really good example of historical fiction accuracy. Another interesting thing is that this book is based on a true story. Grace Marks was a real person. The people she killed, Thomas Kinnear and Nancy Montgomery, were real people as well. And so was James McDermott, who was hanged, and I believe her doctor, Dr. Simon Jordan, I think he was real too. Like, this whole story is based off those real people, and it is fictionalized, but Margaret Atwood said in the afterword that she stuck as strictly to the truth as she could, as far as she could tell, and when she wasn't certain on what was true, she went with the most likely option, and then fictionalized everything else, which I think was a good portion of this book, because it was a murder in the 1800s, and I don't know how much information, factual information, there actually was. It is true. It took me about like a third of the way through to figure out that Grace Marks was a real person. I really don't know what to feel about this book, because it was genuinely really good. The characters were all well developed. It was really well written. I enjoyed all of that. I'm just not certain that I liked it very much. I don't know how to explain it really well, so I'm just going to go through what I liked and what I didn't like. Because it was one of those books that I gave it 3 stars, but not because it was mediocre. I gave it 3 stars because there were a lot of things I liked, but there were also a lot of things I did not like. So to start with the positives, I loved Grace's character. She was really well done and really well developed for the entire story. And I could not, for the life of me, decide for most of the book whether she was a sociopath or the world's most pragmatic realist. It was just really well crafted, and I loved reading her so much for that reason. It was so enjoyable, and I loved her story. She was born in Ireland and came over on a boat with her parents and her siblings and was hired out to work as a servant starting at age 12. And the whole story, like, that she was telling the doctor in prison was fascinating to me, and I don't know how much of it is true and how much of it is fictionalized, just because it was hard to tell in this book what Margaret Atwood made up for herself. But that story was really well done. I loved the writing style. It's so descriptive, but not in a flowery way, in a very direct, descriptive way. Like, she has a tendency to not say very much in her writing outright, but spend a paragraph describing something in a very straight way, and what she doesn't say tends to be more important than what she does, which makes it a really hard read, but it also makes it really interesting. Like, she will spend a paragraph describing a character's appearance, but the thing she doesn't say is how the character doing the describing feels about that person. And that tends to be more important. And it's really well done. Like, you can tell the amount of time and effort that went into all her writing, and it's so beautiful to read, even if it takes pretty much all of your concentration. She took these brief accounts of these real people and real events and turned it into a fully fleshed story with people and characters with motivations for everything, and it was so wonderful. I could not get enough of that. For the things that I didn't like quite so much, I couldn't get into the letters and the excerpts that she included at the beginning of each section. This was split into chapters, and then like several chapters would make a section that was like 40 to 50 pages or something. And at the beginning of each of the sections, she had excerpts from newspaper articles, or poems, or books, or letters that people wrote each other. And I found them tedious to read, and they sort of took me out of the story. A lot of the letters, especially that were included, they didn't always involve major characters. I struggled with trying to figure out who these characters were and what their roles were in the story. It made it much more difficult to read and follow, as opposed to the actual narrative. And I couldn't figure out how much of those sections were fictionalized and what was true. Like, for most of the story, I was okay with not knowing, but for those, some of them were real. I'm like 90% certain that a lot of them were real, but some of the letters I wasn't sure, and I would have liked to know. Like, I just wanted to know if she fictionalized any of those, and which ones, and how much, and I didn't, and that's just sort of bugged me. Especially, there was a section of letters at the end that went on for quite a few pages, and I just wasn't interested in those, and I was so close to the end that I just wanted to know what happened, and I didn't care about the letters. I didn't like the doctor, Dr. Simon Jordan. Like, his role in the story was fine, and I didn't mind his character. I just didn't like that there were sections from the story from his point of view. For the most part, I just did not care what he was going through. I didn't care about his mother, or about his money struggles, or his relationship with his landlady. It felt like a departure from the true story, and whenever there were sections from his point of view, I was just sort of waiting to get back to Grace, and waiting to get back to everything that I cared about. Because I so did not care about him. Like, there were two protagonists in this story. One of them was a convicted murderer, and she was not the least likable person. He was just so irritating, and I was okay with that as far as his role and it pertained to Grace herself. But when it was sort of separate from Grace and he had his own story and side plots going on, I just didn't care, and I didn't really want to know. It just seemed extraneous. This book could have been a lot shorter and more concise without that, and I would have enjoyed that a lot better. The other big thing I couldn't get into was the ending. I did not like the ending at all, and I'm not gonna go into why because I don't want there to be any spoilers. Even though, this is based on a true story, so you can, look it up and figure out what, 2/3 of the ending is. But I didn't like it. It felt plastered on. It felt a lot different than the rest of the story, and it didn't work for me. It felt like it had a very different tone, and I couldn't get into the characters' motivations, and it didn't make sense to me about why they were doing it, when for the rest of the story, everything else had been so clear. There were 2 paths that Grace could have gone down, basically. Well, 3. The whole question was she evil, was she crazy, or was she innocent? Everything she said and did, you could, justify motivations for each of those 3 things, and it was very interesting to go down these paths. And then at the end, it didn't make sense for the other characters and all their motivations, and it just felt off. And I would normally forgive that since it's based on a true story, if Margaret Atwood had taken what actually happened, but the ending was largely fictionalized after a point. It was completely made up. It was all Margaret Atwood, and I did not like what she came up with and what she wrote. It bugged me, and it felt wrong for the story. It was just a disappointing way to end. And I think if it had a stronger ending, that might have bumped it up to 4 stars, but this is going to have to be a 3-star read for me. I did feel like a good part of this book went over my head, which isn't really a shock when it comes to Margaret Atwood, just because her books are very much lit fic and very well researched and very thought-provoking, and I just feel like there were sections of this book that I just didn't get. And it would have been wrong for me to say 4 stars when I felt like it would have been 4 stars if I'd understood everything, but I didn't. Maybe if you know more about 19th century Canada, you'll understand more of it, or especially medical practices in the 19th century. There was a lot of talk about things like mesmerism, which I only know about because of that Alan Rickman movie. And I didn't really pay attention to much in that movie other than Alan Rickman. There were characters that I didn't really like Simon Jordan, his landlady, Dora the maid, basically everyone in that section. And then there were characters that I really enjoyed, like Jeremiah, who I thought were not in the story nearly enough. And again, part of that is because it's based on a true story and there's only so much she can do. But on a whole, I just felt like there was more she could have done to make the story more cohesive and less dragging on, as it were. It took me about a month to read. I started this on May 2nd and finished it on June 5th. And I wasn't reading it the whole time. I read it for about a week, or a few days, in early May. And then I read it for the past week. And there was a very long few weeks in between where I didn't read it at all, and it was a struggle to get into it first. But it picked up a third of the way through, when I finally started getting a grasp on what was going on and who these people were. So it was hard to read. I would highly recommend this, in all honesty. I've read Margaret Atwood before, and I'll read her again, and this book did not disappoint me on a whole. I found it very worthwhile and engrossing and a very interesting read. And I'm actually going to loan this copy to my friend tonight, which is why I'm so quick to film this review. But I would highly recommend you read it. I would say it's not as good as The Handmaid's Tale, maybe. It's very different than The Handmaid's Tale, although they both have the same basic premise of life sucks for women. Saying that this was a 3-star read and leaving it at that seems wrong, just because it was so good and it was so much better than most 3-star reads that I talk about on here that are just mediocre. I'll forget them in a week or two. Because this was amazing, and I can imagine in the future I will come back and reread this, and I might enjoy it more on a reread. now that like I have a basic understanding of the plot and the premise. And I feel like if I read it again, it might be a 4-star read. Just because it takes that long to sort of grasp the story. And then coming back, I would get more of the details and less of it would be like over my head and all of that. But I would recommend that you give this a try, or at least Margaret Atwood in general. I haven't read much by her, but I do have Cat's Eye, and I'm going to read that in a few months, hopefully. But I love her writing, and 3 out of 5, but a solid 3 out of 5, that I would recommend you give a try if you're down for a sort of challenging historical fiction lit fic. Let me know if you've read this book down in the comments and what you thought of it, or if you've read any Margaret Atwood books and have any recommendations for me, because I do want to read a lot more of her. I really, really love her writing style, and I would like to find more books because I feel like she'll have a book out there that I will absolutely love 100%. I will see you all in my next video. Bye, guys!